it depends. So my name is Igor Шавро. You basically mentioned everything what was worth mentioning about me. I've been as an interpreter for 24 years, and I'm only 41, so it's most of my life. And as you mentioned also, I am a sign language interpreter. I work in the UA First, UA Перший TV channel. I can hear myself in my headsets. Can you balance the sound somehow? So the webcam is, I hope it can be seen. All right, so seems to be working. So the visibility of sign language gestures on TV and overall, because the events of the latest months and years made us think about how we, sign language interpreters, look from the side of their audience, of our audience, and viewed by the audience. How much do we match? How we are a match to the scope of work we are invited to do. So the COVID pandemic that started more than a year ago actualized this, made this question even more poignant. How are we perceived? Like sign language, deaf, deaf. And in terms of interpreting, in the US and some European countries, like EU countries, there used to be a best practice where close to the speaker there is a sign language interpreter standing, and they are not cut out from the picture during the broadcast. In Ukraine, this has been a tradition for not so long time. So some traces of this practices could be seen before, some years before, during the official events, and they put a picture of a sign language interpreter in a small square somewhere in the corner of the screen. But I really cannot say that we don't have at all sign language interpreting on TV, because Ukraine, among other Eastern European countries, still until now is a leading country in terms of sign language interpreting in TV broadcast. Some TV channels provide sign language interpreting for a couple of news programs. Some others provide sign language interpretation almost 24/7, like Прямий TV channel. We used to work from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. A little less than 24 hours. So this practice of sign language interpreting of critically important information, like healthcare briefings, daily briefings from the healthcare minister, now they continue to do so. And they ran into a couple of challenges even. And we still see the repercussions of those challenges even now. The first challenge we faced when we introduced sign language interpreting is that we were very short of staff, available interpreters to hire for a TV broadcast of a high enough level of expertise. Also, this practice exposed another problem, that interpreters we hired were not always aware of the level of responsibility in the event, and that caused sometimes problems in their work, and it was visible enough. Another problem that many of the target audience of professional community really took notice of, some of the interpreters in the first wave of interpreters where we ran out of staff. They had not enough sign language competencies and interpreting skills, and they also failed to, or had not yet formed an understanding of professional ethics. So all those challenges that we ran into and they ran into, they resulted in some things. They resulted in the reality where public and TV broadcast interpretation was provided by incompetent or unqualified people who had secondary or inferior skills. And you probably heard about some of the stories that resulted from such interpretation. In other cases, through incompetency or low competency, low skills of the interpreter, the information was distorted and gained a completely unrelated momentum or became undecipherable. And also, we noted throughout this recent history, ran into problems with interpreters not knowing the vocabulary or even refusing to do the job they were hired to do in the first place. And so the interpreters we hired for TV or public events interpretation were substandard sometimes. But these kind of problems are not only prominent in Ukraine, it's just that in Ukraine we ran into cases where public events were interpreted in sign language, and there were, let's say, malfunctions in the interpreting, and that later became in the spotlight of international press. In December 2017, deaf community saw a ceremony of saying goodbye to Nelson Mandela, which was happening in Sokar City in Johannesburg, South Africa. The ceremony was provided with a sign language interpreter. So when an interpreter stands on a ceremony like this, in a stadium like this, where the VIPs sitting all over the place, and the joy of the spectators was short-lived, where the VIPs that arrived, and you can see it on screens, there was some Sankanjanti playing as a sign language interpreter, but he didn't know any sign language whatsoever. While being hired, and he was a court interpreter at Jacob Zuma, President of South African Republic. On the screen, he was just waving his hands chaotically. Enjoy a short clip from the video. Вони кажуть, що ти мудрий, значить ти мудрий. Що на дотик тепле. Ви дуже стійка людина, колишній президент Абунбеки.
Я сподіваюся, всім сподобалося. Насправді, коли мене рисували,
So, I hope you enjoyed it. And people who recorded this video, we even analyzed this interpretation. He used the same gestures, the same signs, was moving his hands in whichever ways he wanted to. So, in 10 years before this case, not only in Ukraine but all over the world, one particular day became part of the professional course books, a subject for course books. What you should never do. In the section, what you should never do, and that was the example. It was November 25, 2004, during the live broadcast of the news, and the first Ukrainian TV channel, sign language interpreter called Natalia Dmitruk ignored the text about the elections announced by election committee that Yanukovych was president, but she used sign language and she said that the results of the election committee are falsified. Our president is Yushchenko. I am ashamed that I had to say lies, interpret lies for such a long time. I'm not going to do that anymore. See you around. Nobody knows other than herself. I tried to locate the original video in the National Archive where I'm staff worker now, and from archivers I've heard the answer that the video disappeared. It was stored on the videotape, and some of the former leadership of the TV channel took that cassette, took that tape, and never returned it again. So, somewhere the same year, Natalia Dmitruk received an international prize, John Obview journalistic award from the then President Yushchenko. So, sign language interpreting of the only TV program by that time that were interpreted in sign language, it was Newsflash 11 a.m. and they removed interpretation because they said the viewers didn't like it. In reality, they said after this case we can never trust sign language interpreters anymore because we can never corroborate whether what they're saying is real interpretation, is matching the original text. So this kind of reaction to that accident, or incident rather, was noted, but no official statement with either condemnation or, on the contrary, of the praise of this heroic deed of interpreter was never issued. And I know I've been an interpreter on public events, and I also interpreted during the VIP meetings, and I also used to interpret for TV. That exact publicity you get as an interpreter is quite a test not everybody is up to. And as members of the interpreter community, we used to think like, it's long enough time now. It's 10 years, 20 years. It's been a while, it's been enough to learn from some of the European practices, but didn't come to pass. And people tend to forget the lessons of the past, only to get surprised again and again. And there's another interpreter, Irina Vishlova, working in Pershi TV channel. She argues that she chooses herself. It's her choice what to interpret, what not. Some 2 months ago, May 20th, during the live broadcast of newly elected President Zelensky speaking live, and she was still practicing her own volition in translation, what to translate, what not. She also allowed her own judgment to be visible in the facial expression. And facial expression in sign language is one of the most important elements. So let's see an excerpt from the video. It's a bit lengthy, but you can see that when she shows something, there's also facial expression that she's doing. So we voted everything, and it's now time to run the platform, to run the open geocadaster, the land register. So that's land reform. And it's important to talk about merging of the services together. It's clear that the Ministry of Economy and first Vice Prime Minister was elected, and that's me and Prime Minister's choice coincided, and we elected the person that showed the best result on the previous position, or still is there. Is there a voting through? Is the voting through for Mr. Lyubchenko? Not yet? All right. So Mr. Lyubchenko showed a serious result, a very serious result. He's an economist, he's a professional person, and answering you and partially to Mr. Sherbina, Let me tell you that, what? Sergey? Yeah, sorry. Sergey Sherbina. And I want to also tell you that it's a very experienced person. Mr. Lubchenko is a very... So, is it not too late to answer? Not yet. How do you feel? Do we need a break? I'm okay. If you need a break, let's make a break. Can we continue? Okay, technical break. So what do we have to do? Are we professionals here? All right. So if you need a break, so let's figure out what do we do next. Maybe the YouTube channel scheme? Sure. Radio Freedom. The microphone will be provided. Good afternoon, Mikhail Tkach, Freedom Radio Scheme. At the beginning of your term, you stressed, Mr. President, in the beginning of your term, you did stress that relations between the authorities and big businesses have to be transparent and public. But contrary to your statement, I don't know why, maybe she did not need to translate all of these things that were said between in between the speeches, all those incongruences and misunderstanding, and some of the things he said. But it was, I wouldn't translate it. I would interpret it. Yeah, we're all impressed by what we've seen. We agree. All right. If you don't object, we would rather go into questions and answers because you have only 5 minutes left, but the questions are pending. Right, but I still would like to finish my thought. So we show the problems, but we still don't show the best results. So this was a response from social networks and Ukrainian TV to this particular incident. There's another interesting case which speaks for itself, and it happened in the U.S. as Joe Biden administration entered into the office, and they started providing sign language interpreting for presidential briefings, because for several years before, even through federal courts, there was a battle to establish it. But what's interesting in that new feature is that all these innovations often face unexpected problems, and one of the interpreters hired to do this interpretation was a Trump supporter, and she was part of many right-wing radical events. And so the question arose, why didn't she go through vetting? Well, she didn't do the bad job of interpreting, but there was a question to White House. Why didn't she go through some sort of vetting? And what could have potentially happened if she let her previous experience and her personal preferences seep into the motivation to do her job? What would be the consequence of that? And specifically for the sign language interpreting profession. But there are also positive cases in this profession, like Lydia Kalis, who was first noted as Mr. Bloomberg sign language interpreter. She became a stellar interpreter. 30 years later, the previous discussion in the public about the rights for access to information for the people with disabilities. So suddenly the bar and the popularity of sign language interpreting job went so high There's another interesting case. The first sign language interpreter in New Zealand, who was hired by Prime Minister of the time, Justine Newalber, and it was not only in response to terrorist attack in Christchurch, but it also became the symbol of fighting coronavirus, this particular hiring. And let me also show the final slide. What kind of solutions could potentially be found to resolve the problems I showed you in the presentation? So, proper or better training for sign language interpreting. The training and education for sign language interpreters should be restarted from scratch, because the heritage of the decades before cannot be processed anymore, cannot be renewed anymore. It's an old system, it's outdated. The employers who hire sign language interpreters have to be aware of their own responsibilities, and they should vet the candidates before they hire sign language interpreters. And recommendations that they could get from organizations like Ukrainian sign language interpreting organization. Quality assurance and certification is another solution. If there is a regular interval certification, like every 5 years, albeit formal, there is a formal certification, but interpreters continue to flail it completely, and they don't go through training mostly. Effective self-governance and things that are happening now, where interpreters create a professional association, I'm all for it. But speaking as an interpreter who is a member of European and World Association, at the moment I only see that creating more associations is not a solution. It's a tug-of-war sort of thing. But I think it will balance itself out somehow, and it's going to be great again for our profession. Thank you. Thank you. You're well within your time limits. It's great. It's very similar to our situation. Right. We're going to take 1 or 2 questions, not more, because we are running late a little bit. Are there any questions? So many impressions that there are no questions. Great. And well, literally everybody was glued to the screen, but there's one question. All right, my question, it was such a detective novel of a presentation that we've listened to. If we had a job with some exotic language like Swahili and Zulu, that we could talk about a situation like this. But here, like with the languages like English and French, you can't hide too much. My question is, like previous speaker said, that there is there's a Ukrainian Association of Sign Language Interpreters, and it seems to be they have some kind of qualification and certification. How should that look at all? How can you really check that and make sure the interpreter is really qualified to the job? What criteria do you use? I don't know what's happening with the association that Natalia is a member of, because I'm not a member of that association. I only know how the certification happens in Ukrainian Deaf Society, because it's been decades. There's no other separate certification body in Ukraine at the moment, so it happens every 5 years. Interpreters come over to some location, there's a station for that, and they use the old system. You are given some small text that you have to simultaneously interpret using sign language, and most frequently it's a system of communication that repeats verbal language or mimics verbal language, and it's not about sign language as such, although they do teach a little bit by a little bit every year. But there are videos of sign language that you then later should translate into verbal language, preferably sticking to literary language norms, so that it doesn't, so that it's accepted and well perceived by the audience. Then some terminology that you have to translate, to make sure that you know the matching terminology, or some complex terminology like homonyms and antonyms. Maybe they can get asked a couple of questions about ethics, like, for instance, how far from the speaker should the interpreter stand? And then, based on this re-qualification, which happens every 5 years, the Central Certification Committee issues a judgment whether the interpreter has proven the same level of competency or has attained a higher level, or should be demoted, let's say, to lower the competency. So, thank you for the presentation. From previous speaker, we heard some theory about sign language interpreting. You provided some practical cases of sign language interpreting. So my question, are there any resources or sources of information that sign language interpreters can refer to while they prepare for the event or for the job? Yes, there are. And the main resource are language carriers, sign language community who use the language, people with hearing impairments. Those are the people to learn from and to refer to. I had a glitch in my Zoom stream, I think. For me as an interpreter, as a practitioner, I realized that you shouldn't really ask other interpreters. That may not be of good service for you. What you should do before is ask among the language carriers. For me, like Natalia Adamyuk, she is a linguist, she is a deaf person, she's a deaf person from childhood, she is a language carrier, and it's not so much as a method of communication for her, rather than a subject of a study. She researches, and she is quite a pioneer in sign language research in Ukraine, and she speaks, that's who I talk to. In most cases, she helps me preparing for events on some complicated topics, and I can tell you about one problem for sign language interpreters for TV and public events. We rarely can have time to prepare. We almost always don't know what to expect. You can read some news programs or watch a talk show before and know in advance what to talk about. We don't know. We can expect anything, and we can only hope that we are educated enough, competent enough at the moment, and know a way around in a topic or two, and be able to at least be able to interpret what we hear and make the people who watch us understand the meaning. But to talk to, so the sources are language carriers, but I don't think interpreters themselves. Thank you. We are only starting to discover this topic for ourselves, and it's highly interesting and exciting. We want to learn more. Thank you. Sorry about the background. It's a robot. He captured me. Just kidding. It's my physical. It's in my gym room. So the materials, I hope, will be made available for you, or you should send me an email and I'll send you a link. Thank you. And have a great rest of the event. All the best.